evening, everyone. Welcome to the Planning Board meeting, Portsmouth City Planning Board. We have a split agenda tonight. The first is the continuation of public hearing on the zoning amendments, and our planning director has a few things she'd like to introduce with respect to this to start things off.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Planning Board members and Chairman. On May 5th, the Board received draft zoning code amendments transmitted from the City Council. Amendments were designed to improve implementation of building height requirements and do provide some structural foundation cleanups for the code for the amendments that will follow. A work session was held on May 19th to review proposed amendments. At that time, public comment and board comments were received, and staff worked to provide appropriate updates. Over the following month after that, staff continued to work with individual members of the board to address comments and corrections, close the loops, make things really clear, and respond to the comments provided on May 19th. And in addition to that, they worked with community members to address some additional comments and concerns. The fourth version of the amendments was presented at the last meeting on June 23rd, with annotated revisions reflecting both public comment and board input. The amendments address long-standing issues such as ambiguities in the ordinance that allows artificial filling to increase building height, closing that loophole and offering clarification there, lack of clarity on height standards for through lots and corner lots, which has created unintended consequences, lack of standards to govern civic buildings that propose alteration or additions, which currently are not regulated, lack of height standards for new streets like Foundry Place, and adjusting High Street Haven Court building height designation to match abutting properties. The amendments also introduced design guidance for common building components, modifying the dimensional requirements for a penthouse so it's located further from the edge so it cannot be seen from the street, adding setback requirements for rooftop mechanical equipment and solar panels, and adding a provision to allow taller decorative roof appurtenances such as towers to raise cornice or parapets. Considered as a whole, this amendment package results in more predictable, consistent, and successful outcomes and provide a more understandable and implementable code on the part of staff, and I think it's more understandable on the part of for the community as well. At this point, I'd like to turn it back to the chair, I think.
Thank you very much. At this point, I don't know how many members have had a chance to go through everything since last week, but now we have an opportunity for questions from board members of staff, and then we'll have further input from the public because this is a continued public hearing. So starting with questions from board members, I'll open it up.
I'll ask a question.
Need time to read, or go ahead, Peter.
This is a question not directed specifically to the changes, but to the process of changes being discussed to propose. Who's setting the priorities for the changes that are coming to us to propose to the City Council?
City Council.
City Council's
Comes
prioritizing
from the
them?
top, yes, based off of the goals that were set up by the council back in January.
And is the planning board allowed to have input to those priorities?
You can have your input, yeah, it's just a matter of, it starts with City Council, who directed the Land Use Committee as to what we're to do, to then send it to the planning board for review and technical gathering of it, and then send it back to City Council for approval. So
as a follow-up to that, the Land Use Committee is advisory, and we don't really have to do it as suggested.
I think there's two processes. What Councilor Monroe is trying to say is the council can give a set of priorities to the Land Use Committee. They could come directly to the Planning Board. In this case, they've gone to the Land Use Committee. The Planning Board can also, of its own volition, come up with ideas for amendments and things of that nature. So there are two different processes. The process we've been following tonight is one that started with the council. I think one of the issues in particular dealing with building height came about because of a recognition earlier this year that there might be a difficulty in interpretation under the existing ordinance, and that created a need for focus on that. Looking at that part of the ordinance, with staff, some of us, and myself included, we realized there were some other things that, needed cleanup. There was a typo on the zoning map, for example. So there are things that, it sort of became a little bit more than what was initially directed by council because of just trying to be duly diligent about it. I don't know if that helps, but.
It does, and cleanup's a wonderful idea. I don't like us being asked to change things. Cleanup is different. Typos, missing things is great, but changing things that have bad optics that could appear to benefit people.
Okay, well, if that's your comment
And-
with respect to something in
Well, it's
particular.
been my comment on several of these, and it hasn't been taken out of this. That's my problem.
You
Okay.
can recommend only a portion of it
If
to
we
back
get
to
that,
city
if we get
council.
that far, I will.
Okay, let's try to keep our comments maybe through me, and, I'll try to do my best to keep things on track here. Yes, Jim?
Mr. Chair, will we be having a presentation tonight?
No.
All right, well, that,
I think the staff could do one, but there's not a lot of time allocated to this, so, and I know that we do have people from the public who wish to speak as well. Do you feel there's just something, if you have a question that requires an image, I'm sure Mr. Cracknell could help with that. I'm not putting you on the
mentally, I
spot.
was expecting a presentation tonight, so I could hear and see, and hopefully Nick would explain maybe some of the issues I had. So if we're not going to have a presentation tonight, I just find myself at kind of not feeling comfortable understanding all that's been presented to us.
All of what's being presented, portions of what's being presented, because I think the comment, this isn't an entire elephant. This can be done in pieces if need be.
Maybe we take the easy ones first.
Excuse me?
Can we, if we, sure, start with civic properties, something very simple.
Well, I think this is more of a work session now. Do you have questions of staff? Then perhaps you should get public input, and then we can talk and decide what we're going to do. Or do you want to just dig into detail? Yes,
Well,
Joe.
I find it difficult for us to do anything without public input first.
That's why I was suggesting we have public input.
Could I suggest a very brief discussion by Nick and then public comment?
Do you have a question particularly to focus,
No,
Nick?
just to summarize, and I understand that there's a letter here summarizing before us, but maybe in words presented to us, might be- just to start the process. We seem to be stuck, that's all.
Okay. Does that work?
That works. Go
I'm
ahead.
just going to do it orally versus a very long PowerPoint presentation. Okay?
Please.
And I think Beverly's hit on many of these comments in the introduction, but there are 4 parts to the building height amendments that are before you. The first part is the building height map and making changes to the building height map. The second is to deal with corner and through lots and how you apportion building heights that are on that map for properties that have multiple building heights, because they're either a corner lot or they're a through lot or they're both. So that's the second part, and clarifying that language. The third relates to the civic properties. The civic district itself, which has a few dozen properties in it, which includes nonprofit museums, churches, they currently are exempt from about 60% of the dimensional controls that are in the code itself. But the remaining dimensional requirements for things like coverage, open space, even setbacks, the front lot line build-out, there's at best ambiguity in the code as to whether those property owners need to seek relief or what standards apply for many of these dimensional controls. And I think it's an oversight of the original language. So we have 2 choices here. We either fill the gaps or we treat them like municipal properties, which are exempt from all dimensional controls. So that's the third part. The fourth part and the final part is dealing with the definitions of building height and addressing the issue of backfilling of first floors to turn them into basements to start measuring from the finished grade. Then there are other amendments in here that deal with roof appurtenances, the mechanical systems, decorative elements that would be added to the roof that are uninhabitable, and modifying the definition of a penthouse to allow it to occur and be exempt not only from the number of stories, which is the current configuration, but also the building height. So that's what's in front of you. And we've been taking input, and if we're not done, we're not done. But there's been an attempt here, since this was sent by the committee and the council, to incorporate input from board members that have spoken up in the past, and certainly that'll continue tonight. So that's sort of a high-level summary of the 4 parts.
Thank you. Do folks have questions now of staff at all? Yes, Jim.
I have a general question on process. This is my first go-through with zoning changes. In the past, has there been efforts to notify the people whose properties are being rezoned that this process has started, so that they're aware that significant changes may be coming?
There's a requirement, there's a statutory requirement, a limited one, that requires direct notice of people. Generally, it's a general notice to all of the public.
And when does that usually happen?
It's my understanding that I believe that if it directly affects, the answer is 100 or less, that you must notify. I think, Stephanie, is that correct? 100 or less, you must do direct notification. If it is more than that, it's considered more area-wide, more legislative in nature, and less site-specific or quasi-judicial. In those cases, that it would not be required. I think that we spent some time with our attorneys reviewing all of these. I may not have that perfectly correct, but staff sat down with our city attorneys to look at all of these together and see which ones might require such notification. I think Nick was involved in that discussion. Nick, do you have anything to add to that direct to butter notification?
Well, I think that's actually absolutely correct, but the general notification did go out
Yes,
before
of
the
course.
first meeting.
Yes.
So, does that help?
So a general notification went out through print media, social media, is that,
It's in the paper.
okay.
Just our standard notification procedures, I think, and that we would have to do for a legislative change in zoning. I think the state standard now actually for legislative zoning changes allows for you to publish it on the webpage as long as it's on the front page, so there's been a new change to that. But we went ahead and observed both the posting on the planning board agenda and also posting in a newspaper of general circulation.
So it's fair to say then, since do these changes involve more than 100 properties, is that fair to say? Is that why the general notice was satisfied?
I believe that's where we concluded at the end.
Okay.
Any other questions of staff? Yes, Greg.
So I'm reading the comments from the original here, and we're being asked to change building heights tonight. But the comments say that the building heights are governed by the HDC.
In the historic district.
Okay. But we're being asked to change a building height in the historic district.
Well, there's a standard, then the HDC can vary that. So the zoning ordinance can say you can go to X, but the HDC can say you can only go to Y because of whatever reasons they may have. And that is in the proposal before us.
Okay, but the comments from staff say something a little different, that it says that HDC controls it.
Within the historic district.
Okay.
So, yep, that's correct.
Yes, Joe.
Which speaks to and I've shared this opinion in the past, it speaks to the importance of, it's not the height of the building that determines the success, it's the design of the building that determines the success, more so than simply height. You know, a fear of height is, is tempered with excellent design, and if there's a design review board in place that's doing its job properly, then the design should be greatly improved.
Could I just add something quick to that for Greg's comment? The building height standards are set on the map as they are today. This is basically doing nothing but making explicit to applicants and the public that the HDC has jurisdiction to set the ultimate height of the building between the min and the max. They can't create a new max, and they can't go below the min. But it's really to state, I can't tell you how many times HDC members have asked in my 11 years, hey, how come we have to have a 50-foot building or a 60-foot building everywhere?
Okay, that's
And
all great, but
yep.
with these two, why don't we go with the lower rather than raising it? The optics of raising a building height, to me, are just horrible. So, for example, over on Congress, or on Congress Street, why don't we drop it down to 40 like it is on the front instead of go up to 45?
Well, the front's 45. If Congress is 45 feet, so that's what we're going to. We're not dropping the,
But
Anyway, other than Congress Street, separating that one intersection.
Foundry Place, the way it's written, why don't we just leave it the way it is all around it? 30 feet instead of going to 60?
Right now, everything on Foundry Place that's been permitted is 60 feet. We are not changing anything with the code other than strapping on the brown line at 50 feet outside the overlay district. So right now, Lot 6, the garage is Lot 1. It's already built, 60 feet tall. Lot 2 is a little park, 7,000 square feet. Lot 3 is a building that isn't built that's going to be 50 feet, didn't use an incentive. It's on the brown line, which is the 50-foot max. And then the corner is almost a 60-foot building that was approved.
But we talk about tearing up from the outer edges of town towards the center of town. Everything around there is low.
What I'm saying is, on Foundry Place, everything is either built at 60 feet, with the exception of Ferguson, the place at the corner of Bridge. Everything is either built or under a building permit to be built at 60 feet. So that, you can't see it yet, other than the garage, but everything around it has already been approved and a building permit's been issued for 60 feet in height. So this was simply rubber sheeting what's on there now, which is a 60-foot height. So I'm not arguing that maybe if we went back 5 years before anything was designed, permitted, and approved, that you could look at doing it differently. But everything that's there on Foundry Place has already been approved and under a building permit. So that's why we chose what we did. And they were all using the existing zoning, which isn't 30 feet.
If it's already permitted, it's really not necessary for us to change all this then.
Well, every street in Portsmouth that's in a character district should have a building height put on it. And Foundry Place didn't exist when we adopted the map. So yes, it should have it. Yeah, that's all.
I'm good.
Just one quick question, Nick. I don't remember if it was I think it was 2 meetings ago, we talked about having an overlay with an aerial. Do you remember, did you have a chance to do anything with that?
And 3D presentation,
Well, we talked
please.
about 3D, and I think that was more of a heavy lift. I'd love to see 3D. Any progress with
I
that?
mean, we have the aerial of the Foundry Place neighborhood that I think was in the presentation last time. I do have that shows, and I think that's what Greg pointed out last time when he saw that. He liked that, but liked being able to see that. But we have the ortho photo that shows the existing building footprints and then the height, but it's not. I can pull it up. Maybe
Okay,
while
so-
the next question's being put together, I can go pull that out of the slideshow if it's helpful.
So you have the ortho overlay, you don't have anything 3D. I know those are
No,
questions.
I don't have
whether-
a 3D. All the 3D modeling that was done for the buildings that aren't yet built, some of that's online in the city webpage to look at from the applicants, because they were required to run all those buildings through a 3D model. So they are available, we just didn't produce them, right? So Greg, if you want to see what isn't built that's under construction,
I think the minutes were clear that I asked for both, and we didn't get them yet.
okay?
Any other questions of staff? Okay, I'm going to open it up to public discussion. Anybody from the public would like to speak with regard to this proposed zoning amendments?
Good evening, Rick Beckstead, 1395 Business Street. I really appreciate you guys having this meeting and listening to the discussions. I'm not sure if there's adequate time or if there was adequate notification. So I understand Beverly's, interpretation as far as with the 100 residents and then not 100 residents and how we do this. And I feel that I'm reliving a nightmare that happened that basically put us into a lawsuit with the Cutts Avenue with about 35 or 36 houses that are there that I believe, and Bob could probably tell you, that the city is still under litigation. I'm not privy to certain things, but my guess is it's still ongoing. There was no notification, and if there was a notification, it was too late. And we had gone and created these character-based areas in town, and it wasn't properly notified. And I'm thinking to myself that this is the same thing, and misspoke or overlooked or anything like that, I guess could be taken into consideration. My recommendation would be that the planning board actually have a work session. I think there's a lot of questions. The advertising too was a little sketchy because I had gone and expected at your last planning board meeting that this stuff was going to be addressed. So I guess with the advertising that happened, and I pulled at the packet, there was almost 800 pages. God bless all of you for looking at 800 pages and trying to figure that out. But I think the public and the notifications they got was on the previous one. And I want to remind everybody, and I think most people know, school vacation just started, just got out. You're talking about some prominent neighborhoods that have been looked at from time to time with scrutiny. You do have renters, you do have families that are in some of these areas that, again, it's vacation. That this is something that would go and take place in the fall when everybody gets back and not right when they get back from vacation. I seem to think we're repeating ourselves. I've lived a real good chunk of my life, at least a quarter of my life almost, following these processes and these procedures. And I guess I would probably just ask that the planning board possibly do something a little bit later on. I'm not sure where these asks came from, but every time I look at them, and I came back down to familiarize with the areas, it's areas that were met with development that is going to take place, things that are going to happen. I'm no fan of making amendments to some of your rules and then meeting a certain type of development that is meant to be there, or it has gone and been discussed, and Heidemann is one of those places we all know has been discussed time and time again, and exactly what this is going to do. I don't think there's enough information for the public. I don't think it's the right time, and I don't think you have the information that you're looking for. I would request a work session, and more than 30 minutes would probably be more than adequate. So again, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Paige Trace, 27 Hancock Street. I'm not here as Paige Trace, 27 Hancock Street this evening. I am here as Paige Trace, President of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the state of New Hampshire. We own the Moffett Ladd House. We are very privileged to own that National Historic Landmark. But I'm trying to figure out who decided that it was necessary, with all due respect, to change 4 different types of zoning with our property. You changed up above the garden by the Hilton Garden Inn. At the top of the garden, you changed it to yellow. Down below in front of the house, it's green. Across Market Street, it's green again. And then down at the water, although our property goes all the way from Market to the water, because Ceres Street actually stops at our property line, you changed it to blue. Now, I'm sure that someone has a reason for this. I'm trying to still determine who felt there was a problem with our zoning. We're a National Historic Landmark. We have the last view shed from a private, historic 18th century house down to its original wharfs. Why in the world would we need our zoning changed to do something else? Our job is to protect that property, not to sell it or do something else or allow someone else to do something with it. So I guess for me, I'm here tonight not because the city told me. There's no transparency there. The organization wasn't notified. The House wasn't notified. I found out from a fellow past counselor who was kind enough to send me the information. And I know that Councilor Moreau, with all due respect, you will say, well, your turn to speak is when the city council looks at this. And I say, with all due respect, the pie has been in the oven's been on, the timer's gone off, and it's baked at that point. I am here tonight to ask all of you on the planning board to consider the fact that there was zero transparency. And we, as an organization that owns a National Historic Landmark, deserve the privilege of being informed that someone decided there was a problem with our zoning. It's the very least you could do. There's 7 National Historic Landmarks in the city of Portsmouth. Ours is one of them. And if anyone had taken the time to realize how our property lays out down on Ceres Street, then there would be obviously no need to put green and then blue on the water. It makes no sense. We're charged with protecting the property, not selling it off. And so I ask all of you, please, a little transparency. I don't know that anyone else in town that you've decided to fix and shore up in the way of nonprofits knows anything about this meeting tonight. And I'm sure if they did, they'd be here. So please, in the future, a little transparency, the transparency that is necessary for something like this. Knowledge is power. Knowledge makes things go a little smoother. And I also would say that if the council has decided that there's a problem with our large holding of land with a water view in downtown Portsmouth, then I'd love to know what the council felt was the issue with our zoning. And I'd like to know with enough time to talk about it, considering that 100 Market Street is 5 stories, and they're our next door neighbor. I mean, this is spot zoning to my mind, and I'm not a land use official, but what you're doing to us is spot zoning without any notification. And I don't use those words lightly, so please, help us out. Help everyone else in the city that this is going on with. And I thank you all for what you're doing, and I thank you all on the planning board for your time. But this is not the way it should be done in Portsmouth. A little communication goes a long way, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening, Duncan McCallum, 536 State Street. I have not had the opportunity to, first of all, let me say this by way of introduction. I'm against these proposed zoning changes. I have not had a chance to study them as careful as I would have liked to. I was made aware that they were on the city's website, but I had to rummage around for them. They were not part of this evening's information packet. After rummaging around, I finally discovered that they were part of the information packet for the January 23rd meeting, but I only discovered that this afternoon, so I haven't had a chance to review these in detail. But I can tell you that my preliminary impression is that who drafted these things, these look like they were zoning amendments that were drafted by the developers, because it makes one concession after another to them. The thing that arrests me the most is the proposal for increase in building height. there should not be any increase in building height. If anything, the building height should be lowered, because with increased building height comes increased mass and the increased danger of destroying the character of the downtown area. In addition, Ms. Trace just mentioned she believes that there was one glaring example of spot zoning. I believe I observed several instances of spot zoning in these proposed amendments. Again, I have not had the time or the opportunity to study them as carefully as I would have liked. But my overall impression is that they are bad. Again, they look like they were drafted by the developers themselves, I guess in part because they are so prolix. You can't understand the damn things. So for all of those reasons, I think that the planning board ought to be, the planning department ought to be sent back to the drawing board on this, and I think that there need to be serious reforms on this. Also, to touch on a point that was made by one of the earlier speakers, it was mentioned correctly that the HDC does have the authority to deep six a particular project, even though it meets all of the zoning requirements, including that of height. But the problem is that in practice, the HDC never does it. So I just think that that is a fact that ought to be taken into consideration. But in any event, I'm here this evening to say that even though I haven't had a chance to study this as carefully as I'd like, I really think I'm against all of the proposed zoning amendments that I see in this package. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Peter Huda, 280 South Street. My first comment is, if you are forced to vote on this tonight, in this half hour that we've gotten, I urge you to vote no on these proposed changes to the ordinance. My belief is this is a blatant attempt to circumvent the BOA. And I believe we're looking at spot zoning here. The spots are specifically noted on the first page. I am not very familiar with the zoning, I will admit it, so I did some research. And I'd like to read to you what I found. What are the differences between spot zoning and a variance? Spot zoning is the zoning of a small, irregularly shaped parcel of land differently from the zoning of the surrounding land. A variance is a permission from the Zoning Board of Appeals to use the land in a way that it was not allowed by the zoning ordinance. So what you're doing here is going around the BOA and changing the ordinances. So nobody has to go for a variance because it's going to be in here. That's wrong. Spot zoning usually does not allow for a particular use of a piece of land that would not be allowed under the current zoning. This is often done to allow a business to locate in the area that is zoned for residential use. A variance is usually granted to allow a use that is not specifically allowed by the ordinance, which you want to change, but which is similar in uses that are allowed. For example, a variance might be granted to allow a daycare center in a zoned area. Spot zoning may be seen as a way to circumvent the zoning process, while a variance is seen as a way to use that is not for a use that is not allowed, but which is not harmful to the surrounding area. I will note two specific areas in here where this would be harmful. And the note on that should be noted that since the beginning of time of the planning board, we have not had to identify public places. But since we have a developer coming forward that would actually be benefiting from the change of the height in the various places, i.e. the Hanover Garage for Mr. McNabb and his new project, and the Foundry Garage for the project that was currently or previously before you that requested a 5-story building in the Heinemann that would affect the West End residents very adversely, as all their houses are 2 stories. Spot zoning is often done without any public input or review. We heard that tonight, we saw that tonight. While a variance must be approved by the Zoning Board of Appeals, which usually holds a public hearing. Spot zoning may be done for any reason, while a variance must be granted for a legitimate reason, such as hardship or the need for a particular use in the area. Spot zoning may be done without any notice to the surrounding property owners, as we've seen tonight, while a variance must be published in a local newspaper. Spot zoning may be challenged in court, while a variance is usually non-challengeable. And I kept researching, and I actually found that Portsmouth has a precedent that was set on the case of Bose versus Portsmouth. Rezoning of 42-acre parcel to light industrial when it was surrounded by hundreds of acres of residentially zoned property was invalid. Testimony showed no compelling need for more limited industrial land since the city had over 800 acres zoned for the purpose and almost 700 acres were vacant. This was noted as a good case of a legislative body attempting to use the zoning process to accomplish a particular good for a person or group without paying proper attention to the fact that the land use regulation is designed to affect the land and not necessarily just the persons presently desiring to use it. So with all of this, and it seems that the planning board has not had sufficient information, has not had their request fulfilled by the staff, I would urge you to postpone this and wait until you have more information, as this really looks like spot zoning. Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody else wishes to speak, I should point out the entire package has been on the city website for a while, and we appreciate if you feel it's spot zoning or not, you can just say that. You don't have to go through the whole explanation of what it is and what it isn't. We're pretty good at figuring that out. So, next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. My name is FX Bruton, and I'm here representing Coventry Assets, and they own the building at 1 Congress Street. I'd like to speak to the issue of spot zoning, and I think it was highlighted in the examples that were discussed and in the definitions. That typically relates to use changes in terms of your changing your ordinance for uses, industrial use in a residential zone, things like that. It doesn't really relate to what you're talking about tonight. So, and I'd also like to speak to process, as was correctly pointed out by the chair. Your process in Portsmouth relates to two types of zoning changes. One is to the city council, which in this case they have asked you to look at changes that they've considered and give your recommendations. And so that's the process that we're in now, is just the city council looking for your recommendations for the changes that they have introduced. There is another process where the planning board could go through their process and look at zoning changes as well, but that's not what's in front of you tonight. So basically, with respect to the parcel that relates to 1 Congress Street, I think if you look at the area, the whole area is a similar color, other than this parcel that is now merged. There's two parcels that were merged into one. And this is only an attempt to make everything in that parcel similar to the surrounding parcels. And if you may recall back at your workshop, which was the beginning of talking about these zoning changes, I think Mr. Cracknell mentioned that when they were looking at that area, they didn't really pay particular attention to that area in the back next to the garage, and this is an attempt to bring everything to be consistent with what is surrounding. So I'm hopeful that you will make a recommendation to the city council, as they've requested that you do, and again, respect that process in terms of how Portsmouth looks at these changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know.
Esther Kennedy, 41 Pickering Ave. I think we just heard the answer, folks. We had a developer here asking you to pass it. And he just talked about one property, one issue. Now, I've heard that this has been on the website. It has. I'm not disagreeing with that. But I also know tonight's meeting was originally scheduled on the website for 6:30, and it got moved to 6. I also know on tonight's meeting, the agenda did not say there was public comment. I also know that I expected to come after watching the last meeting, hearing some of your questions, and having some answers from the city. Because I truly believe many residents do not want more mass and bigger buildings. I had an opportunity to sit on the HTC with Mr. Amita, and I've heard him say numerous times it's about the design of the building. I would agree. However, I also, sitting on the HTC many times, it's hard to say no to a developer when there's such a range. It's hard for them, in many cases sometimes, to do what should be right for Portsmouth. Right now, the way I look at it, with the amount of building we have and the amount of building we have in the pipeline, we have a couple of developers that are making a lot of money on our city. We have a choice. We have a big choice. What do you want Portsmouth to be? And I've heard numerous times that we want to keep it a waterfront place that people want to visit. You know, I've said to people, we have to decide what's going to make people come out of Boston to visit Portsmouth. And if we look like Boston, then why leave it? And I don't want to be a dead city. So I ask you to look at the height. And if we're going to look at ordinance, let's look at the parking. Why don't we do it all? Why are we only doing one thing, Councilor Moreau? You know, you say it came from the city council, but it also came from this land use development board that was formed. And I guess my question is, if we're really going to look at ordinance changes to our zoning, then let's look at everything as a package. Let's have the public be part of the discussion. When we did with Mr. Cracknell, when I sat on the ACC, and we did the zoning for heights, and we looked at overlay zoning and all that stuff, we had public input. We had 3 days of charrettes. I guess where are the charrettes? What's the need to be secret? Is it because we're catering to developers and not citizens? That would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have, I know, we do have some other folks waiting, so I'm going to, Ms. Browder, please, yes, you may approach. After you're done speaking, I think we need to decide what we're doing this evening with this and get on to our next matter as best we can, but please proceed. I know we have, your comments were sent in as well, but go ahead.
All right. My name is Elizabeth Browder, property owner, 159 McDonough Street. I am fully aware of what's happening here, and there are many changes that are kind of overwhelming. I went to see Nick and visited with him to have conversations about things I didn't understand. I think it would be very helpful for all of the people and the public to have a presentation that explains the reasons behind why the ordinances were changed and the wording of them. Because I found it very helpful. There were some little things I nitpicked about, but generally speaking, some of the changes to the ordinances will actually protect neighborhoods better if you understand the wording and how that change has impacted. Some of the changes came about because of things I complained about, and I know that because I complain a lot. I call and ask 100 questions. I want someone to explain the zoning ordinances to me in a way I can understand them. I don't want any gray areas. I'm very black and white. And I want to know when something is written, how is it that they're able to weasel their way around and get away with it? So I want these ordinances to say what they mean. There shouldn't be so much gray in our ordinances. So these ordinances are trying to clean up some of that gray. And I think it would be helpful to have a small presentation done by Nick or whoever wants to be the person who gets to have that lovely job, to explain why the wording was changed in these specific things relating to height. My biggest complaint is 2 heights on one lot. The way it's written, it's a field day for developers. It's a real field day, and I've watched it. I've been watching, I probably have 6 or 7 developments that I've been to every single meeting, starting with TAC, starting with HDC, environmental, the whole 9 yards. I go to all the meetings. I don't skip around. I go to all of them. So I think that would be very helpful. I think that there are 2 areas here on this that may need to be looked at separately. Number 3, obviously, is raising a lot of hairs. It does for me. And number 2, I don't concur with Nick on his thinking. There are 3 other parcels along that property for number 2, which I believe eventually will come forward, and I don't want to have them have the carte blanche that that's being presented. So that's all I have to say for now. I would like to see a presentation done. I think when zoning changes are made, you should see the original, and then you should be able to see what was changed. And if you look at my letters, I try to do that. I show you what's there and what's here now, so that you can see how the wording changed and what are the questions that come about from that. So that would be my suggestion. And I have another meeting too. So good night.
Thank you. Just as a point of clarification, there have been a number of meetings to talk about this, and Nick did make a presentation at one of the earlier meetings that was much more detailed with what was being discussed. Some questions came up. Mr. Mahana had some questions, as he mentioned earlier. This is not something that just sprang from the earth this morning and landed on the website tonight. And also, by the nature of any proposed zoning change, landowners will be affected. So the fact that one landowner's property brought a particular matter to the attention of the city that started some of this process, not all of it, but some of it, is a reality. It's not, this isn't, I know because I've been involved in conversations with staff myself, this is not about trying to cater to a developer. So you may not like it, and that's a different question. And it may need to be voted down. That's a different question, but that's not how that's not the genesis of why this got written up the way it's been written up. So what's the board's desire? Should we go ahead?
Table it.
We have to continue it. If we're going to continue it, continue all of it, we could recommend portions of it. I'm concerned that that's going to require more discussion than we probably have time for tonight.
We've been waiting for the CUP training for 4 months. I mean, it's time to move on.
Anybody feel otherwise?
Mr. Chair, I'd be in favor of tabling what we're calling Section 1, which is the height map changes, but recommending to City Council 2, 3, and 4, which is essentially the actual language change within the ordinance itself.
I think, go ahead.
I would be against that because I was reading through this stuff. There's, again, too many things, but I'm looking at something in 10.517 that reduces something by a factor of 4 with no reasonable explanation. The distance that the railing should be from the edge of a building has been reduced by 4. And no explanation.
If that was a motion that was made, I would second it to table the whole thing, because what we're hearing from people is that they haven't had they don't understand the entire thing. I'm just talking about members of the public. So if we're not cherry picking one thing to discuss and to vote. If the entire thing is in question, then let's table the whole damn thing. Let's not.
Well, let's do the proper thing. If you're making a motion to continue, let's
Yes.
continue it
Yes.
to the July
To a set date.
meeting. We have to pick a time. This is a public hearing.
Yep.
So we have to continue it to
However, I mean, continuing to the next planning board meeting isn't my intent. I'd like to see exactly what I've asked for before, more information, sitting with each other, asking questions. We didn't get to do that. We get presentations, but we don't get to say why. I want to know why that particular thing was changed.
And that can happen if we continue it, the public continues to be noticed, we continue to have public discussion. I think, are you asking we just withdraw the entire thing and not do anything further? What do you?
I don't think it's ready for consideration. You can interpret that however you want, but I don't think this is ready for consideration.
In which
As
case?
a whole, as a whole. I mean, the only thing I could say was we could adopt the one number about civic properties. Because that's a clear whole.
Jim?
I am inclined to table, postpone, whatever the proper word is, but I'd really like to see a separate meeting with a new presentation. I know that's a lot of work for staff, but I think there's been changes since the last presentation. I think it would really help at least me and the public if we just concentrated a separate meeting for this topic. It's very clean. We don't have to worry about time. We don't have to worry about poor people waiting for us to finish up. That's my thoughts.
Might I make a suggestion?
Yes, you may.
It sounds like in order to make sure we have proper process as far as a motion goes, that maybe we want to make a motion to continue it till maybe our August meeting, while in the meantime trying to have either another work session or a special meeting scheduled. But as long as we at least do it to a set date, not to a no-end date, and then maybe try to move it up to a special meeting that we can then notice sometime between now and that point.
So we could continue this to the August 18th planning board meeting with a work session on July 28th, which is the second meeting in July, which is for workshop matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I won't.
Want me to amend that?
I can just tell you, I'm going to be at the Elton John concert on July 28th. So
Well, he
I
can
won't be
come here.
Sorry. I don't think he wants to come here. I'll be making that date very special in my head.
It's the summer.
Enjoy it.
It's the summer.
It's hard.
Why don't we continue it to the continue the public hearing and continue discussion to the August meeting? Staff will send out a poll for potential dates for a special work session to continue review of the amendments.
Before that's official, does everybody sound like a reasonable idea?
I like it.
And then you just amended your motion to
I
say that,
amended
right?
my motion to say that.
Do we have a second on that? I think we did.
I'll second that.
And you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Will there be any discussion prior to the vote? There's one other thing I'd like to say.
Yes, yes.
but- Okay.
So, did you have anything to say about the motion? We're proposing to continue this to the August 18th. I think that was the date.
I don't think,
Yes. It's
yeah, I don't,
the August meeting.
that's a good solution. I don't think it needs much explanation. Thank you.
And with staff working on trying to get us together before that to,
Please.
at a public session.
Sorry, to be clear, this is being tabled to the August 18th meeting?
Continued.
Continue.
I'm sorry, and then there'll be a special standalone meeting for this topic before that.
Prior to that, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Joe, you had,
You might have spoken to this. It's worth repeating and being a little bit more firm and clear about it. The idea that, I mean, we heard a couple of times tonight, the idea that something's being done in secret here, and I don't want that idea to leave the room. It's not, I mean, the fact that something's being done in secret is, I think we need to address when things like that are said. And I believe that you began to address that, and you did a very good job at it. It's just worth repeating and firmly repeating it.
okay, well, as a point of clarification, we didn't have a line item notice on the agenda for public input, but this is a continued public hearing, so by definition, it's for public input. If people would be more comfortable seeing a line item saying public input, fine, but that's what a continued public hearing is for public input, which is why we had public input. So, this was not in any way, I don't think there's anybody sitting up here, there better not be, who's, up for secret meetings, so. Yes.
Although not a voting member in this capacity on this matter, I felt like there were some valid points, both from members up here, members of staff, as well as members of the public who had spoken to the residual impact on adjacent neighborhoods, the purpose and determination to get these certain changes implemented, as well as the timing of it all. And sometimes I feel as though we get very pigeonholed on some of these issues. And then when we have these public input opportunities, we do get nice letters that maybe share information from a different lens. And so to the point that Mr. Almeida just brought up, as well as you, Mr. Chair, there could be another platform, and I understand we have to go through certain processes to vote and do these things, but the public input scenarios, in my mind, may not necessarily have to be in this setting, and they could potentially be out on a site walk or potentially be around this round table where there are more shared images and illustrations where people are getting a better and more dynamic, comprehensive view of what we are discussing. And I know that shadow boxes and illustrations through a 3D model may help, but nonetheless, these are real changes to a neighboring property that may be 20 feet high versus 60 feet. And to me, I'm a very visual learner, so that could be done in a variety of ways. And so my statement, more than anything, is if we do have another meeting, at least please consider or look at an opportunity to do so outside when it is the summer and we have the ability to go and do this. Like, I feel as though that little bit of extra effort in the next month and a half may give us plenty of perspective in the long run, where these changes are almost irreversible to some extent if we build a 60-foot building versus, whatever else. So that's my sentiment and that's my stance on it. And if that's something that we can do, I'm more than willing to take the extra 2-3 days or however long it needs to be to really get that full understanding. So I just felt like that maybe some of the other folks of the member of the public and staff and up here may have that shared perspective, I hope, at least.
Thank you. And our city manager is watching and participating by Zoom. Did you have anything you don't see on the screen?
No, I'm here. I'm here, Mr. Chairman. I'm listening intently. I don't have any comments at this time.
Okay, I know we're about to lose you too, so I want to get this vote. We have to do a roll call vote for this continuance. Everybody ready for the vote? We have a roll call vote, please.
Planning Board Member Hewitt?
Yes.
Planning Board Member Almeida?
Yes.
Vice Chair Clark?
Yes.
City Manager Conard?
Yes.
Chairman Chelman?
Yes.
Councilor Moreau?
Yes.
Planning Board Member Harris?
Yes.
Planning Board Member Mahana?
Yes.
Planning Board Member Simonis?
Yes. Thank you very much. I think that concludes this portion of this meeting. The public hearing has been continued to August. We will let everybody know when we're going to be meeting to talk about this once we have a date and where it will be located, whether it's outside or under the stars or in here under this beautiful ceiling. We will now join the Conservation Commission.
That was hard.
Oh, we're gonna do sides? Yeah.
Corey, you're over here. I'm just gonna sit here. Or I can grab my other one. I have two. I have two.
Well, it'd be nice to see each
There you go.
Stephanie,
Just a little bit.
we have an extra one for Corey. For Corey. How's it going, Sandy? All right.
Yeah.
There's Andrew.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Because I was so not heavy trust.
I stuck you. No, I think it's fine. I like it a little cool. Get two warm ones.
So are you doing minutes?
I will be doing that.
Okay. Then I don't have to ask.
I hope so.
Great way to summarize it.
Thinking it for a while.
Well, if we're all ready, I guess I'll convene. Planning Board and Conservation Commission, thank you very much. We have Mr. Buckley and, now I don't remember your name,
Miss Crystal.
Ms. Crystal. You have a background with DES,
Yep, yep.
and Mr. Buckley is one of the senior counsel from Municipal Association.
Good evening.
Well, I'll turn it over to you guys.
So the purpose here was to give a general introduction, both legally and with the assistance of Sandy, from an environmental perspective on wetland regulation, and looking to some degree at some of the details of the Portsmouth zoning ordinance and how it regulates permitted uses and uses that require a conditional use permit under the Section 10 at 1017 of the Portsmouth ordinance. So what I wanted to do here today was to give you just a general introduction to the law of conditional use permits and really compare it to special exceptions, because we really don't have a lot of guidance in the zoning and planning statutes on how conditional use permits are supposed to be treated. Is it like a conditional use permit? Is it like a variance? Well, it's different. Excuse me. Is it like a special exception? The intent here is to just give a general introduction on how the zoning and planning statutes address conditional use permits and how they're managed and delegated in this instance to the Portsmouth Planning Board. Next slide. So the independent land use controls were generally introduced to the zoning and planning statutes when the entire statutory structure for zoning and planning was reoriented and readopted in 1984. And the purpose, I think, was generally to give more flexibility to zoning regulation and to create different ways in which a local land use administrator, mostly in most instances as the planning board, can do such thing as timing incentives, phase development, intensity and use incentives, transfer of density and development rights, but most important, the last of these requirements, environmental characteristic zoning. And that is really what many people have derived from the authority to have a conditional use permit process to regulate and address the concern for the protection of wetlands. And so what I think in most ordinances that I've dealt with, in many instances, a lot of towns and cities have become to understand it's more sensible to create a system where if a development proposal is before the planning board proposing a site plan or a subdivision and there's an impact to wetlands, does it make sense for the applicant to first get a special exception from the conservation, the ZBA, and maybe with input from the Conservation Commission, or do you try to harmonize the whole process in one regulatory body? So that's, in a sense, what the conditional use permit process allows you to do, to allow the planning board to address the wetland impacts as part of the process of addressing a subdivision or a site plan. And so the point of view that I bring to the process is I think it is administratively more appropriate to have one land use board dealing with these issues, and that's why I would imagine Portsmouth and many other communities have delegated the regulation of wetland impacts to the conditional use process from the planning board. Next slide, please. So there were additional innovative land use controls that were added since 1984. Probably the most important and most well-known was impact fees, which I believe was adopted by the legislature as an amendment to the innovative land use control statute in 1991. But the village plan alternative is there's another one called the integrated land use development permit option and inclusionary zoning. All were added since 1984. Next slide, please. So in general, the statute has a number of important elements when innovative land use control or a conditional use permit process is adopted by a city or a municipality. First, it really should be the case that it's a necessity or seen to be a requirement from the master plan or be supported by elements of the master plan. Number two, the innovative land use control has to contain within it standards that guide the person or board that are going to grant the CUP. The standards obviously are very important. And then it has to provide for an administrative process, and that's typically designed to either delegate it to the planning board, and if not delegated to the planning board, you could have a CUP process delegated to select boards, city councils, and other administrative officials. The planning board has to be involved in the process. And I think it just speaks loudly about the paramount role that the planning board plays in the CUP process. If you're not the administrator, you have to have the ability to comment and participate in the decision-making process. Next slide, please. However, if the planning board doesn't administer the permit, then of course there has to be a collaborative information sharing between the actual administrator and the planning board, and then the planning board's comments, to the extent that the planning board is not involved, have to be incorporated into findings and decisions. So again, that's just emphasizing the fact that the planning board is really an important administrative role in any CUP that may be adopted by a municipality. Next slide, please. The necessity of having standards, of course, is similar to, as I've compared here in this slide and other slides, to the special exception process. So one of the things we don't have in the zoning and planning statutes is a definition of what are the things that a CUP, how it should be handled and administered. So to that degree, I think the fairest way to compare how you deal with a CUP or the CUP process to look at, generally speaking, how the ZBA handles special exceptions. And just for the purpose of completeness, your zoning board of adjustment has two really important, probably three, if I should be more complete in the discussion, authorities that the ZBA has to administer relief under the zoning ordinance. It's got to have a ZBA in order to address the unique characteristics of land to ensure that zoning doesn't affect a regulatory taking or a taking of property without public compensation. And so the ZBA under 674-33 can do three things. They can grant variances, they can grant special exceptions, and they can address administrative appeals. A special exception, from my mind, is almost a parallel to the CUP, because the special exception says we here in our ordinance are going to allow a particular use as long as you can satisfy these criteria. Whereas a variance requires a discretionary judgment on the part of the ZBA. Does it meet the 5 criteria for granting a variance? Then it's a discretionary issue. But with a special exception, and I think that's similar to a way to look at a CUP, if the applicant can demonstrate compliance with all of the criteria of the CUP, then I think the administrative body, the planning board in this instance, would have to grant that approval because they satisfy those criteria. So again, I think the point here is that if you have a CUP as compared to a special exception process, the intent is to ensure it's in accordance with the general and specific rules contained in the ordinance. Next slide, please. So as I've indicated, I think it's fair to say a CUP or conditional use permit is essentially equivalent to a special exception. And if you look at the special exception provisions of RSA 674-33, you again have to have these standards that guide the person who grants or administers the permits. And when the planning board is deciding to grant or deny a conditional use permit, a similar expectation has to apply. You have to have those standards, and if the person satisfies the criteria, then the CUP ought to be granted. Next slide, please. But when acting on granting a CUP application, the board, the planning board in this instance, can't vary those requirements. They are set forth in the ordinance. They've been adopted by your legislative body, the city council. These are the requirements that have to be satisfied. So when a ZBA is addressing a special exception, the same standards apply, and that's the comparison we're drawing here between a CUP and a special exception. You have to meet each of the requirements, and the ZBA can't vary them. There's been a number of cases on that issue for special exceptions where a party will ask the ZBA, I can satisfy 5 of these criteria, but I'd like you to modify criteria number 6. And ZBAs are prohibited from doing that. You have to demonstrate compliance with all the requirements of the special exception. And I think that would be the same thing true with the CUP. That the zoning board, the planning board cannot modify those requirements for granting a CUP. Next slide, please. But the planning board, when it acts on granting a CUP, certainly can attach conditions. So there is an ability, just like the ZBA can attach conditions to the approval of a special exception, when the planning board is acting on the granting of a conditional use permit, the planning board could attach a condition. And I did try to draw a parallel to section 10-1750. This is requirement number 6 of your ordinance with regards to granting of CUP for a use in a wetland, impacting a wetland area. The zoning ordinance says that you have to provide for a vegetative buffer strip that will be returned to a natural state to the extent feasible as a requirement of granting the CUP. So I think a condition that would be reasonable in that setting would be the planning board saying that the criterion to get that return to the natural state would be achieved within a certain specified period of time. So the condition is related, that you would assess, you would require, is related to that particular requirement or criteria for granting a special exception. Next slide, please. So looking at Portsmouth's specific conditional use criteria, approval criteria, I've made a couple of observations. You do have general approval criteria for conditional use permits under section 10-243-30, but it's pretty clear that these don't apply to the requirements for granting a wetland CUP. The only ones that would apply for general development activities are the 6 criteria set forth in 10-1750, but then you have separate CUP requirements for rights-of-way or public and private utilities and rights-of-way. They have separate criteria in 10-1760. The other one, I think, which was a very prudent thing for the city to have in this regulation for CUPs, that they expire with 1 year of approval unless a building permit is issued prior to that date. And I think that's a reasonable way to ensure there's actual activity related to the permit that had been granted under that CUP. Next slide, please. A couple other things I think are important to note about a conditional use permit, again, comparing it to a special exception, and differentiating to some degree from a special exception. RSA 675:5, Roman 3, contains when you have an innovative land use control, which is what a CUP is, adopted into 674:21, which has administration delegated to the planning board, then any decision that is made by the planning board cannot be appealed to the zoning board of adjustment. CUPs are independent, separate decisions made by the planning board that can only be appealed to the Superior Court. These are not matters that can be separately appealed to the zoning board of adjustment. But I think you could also incorporate in a process, and this might be something to be considered if you don't have it in your rules of procedure already, if someone was aggrieved by a decision you made under a CUP and you want to reconsider your decision, you could permit people to ask for a reconsideration, but I think you would have to do that within the 30-day time period before you would appeal to the Superior Court. So I think there's a reason to say that based upon a Supreme Court case, 74 Cox Street LLC, which stands for the proposition that any land use board has the inherent authority to reconsider their judgment and decision before the appeal period runs out. So I think that if you had a situation where someone didn't like a CUP decision, they could apply to the board for asking the board on its own to reconsider the case or the decision, and you could do so long as the 30-day appeal period had not run out. So that's something to keep in mind, and I think it would be a prudent thing if you wanted to put that as a part of your rules of procedure. Next slide, please. By the way, I'm happy to take questions at any time. I don't want to rule the whole process here, but want to let you know, happy to take any questions you might have.
Coming back then to the 6 criteria in our ordinance, I think you made it very clear, and I agree with you. All 6 of those criteria must be met in order to grant a CUP.
That's right, absolutely. They have to be satisfied to the expectation or the consideration of the planning board. Question?
Yes. So when you talked about conditions or stipulations that can be placed on a CUP, I'm wondering boundaries, what the boundaries might be to those stipulations?
I think any condition has to be related to the particular criteria. So if you're going to say, like I pointed out before, the criteria where you had to bring into the vegetative buffer, that you could set as a condition of that vegetative buffer requirement that achieve the natural state within a certain period of time, as the case may be. So any of the conditions you want to add to the granting of the CUP really should be related to one of the criteria, one of the 6 criteria set forth in the ordinance. So the other thing I wanted to just bring to your attention, I'm sure you've had this kind of information shared with you before, dealing with wetland regulations, I think there's reason to be cognizant of the constitutional limitation on regulatory authority under zoning. And I think in particular, there's 2 sets of constitutional limitations that apply to actions that would be taken to grant or deny a CUP. The first, of course, is the New Hampshire Constitution the first part, Article 12. And I would just note that I've highlighted the section of that part of our New Hampshire Constitution. No part of a person's property shall be taken from him or applied to public uses without his own consent or that of the representative body of the people, which is many times seen as essentially applying the same standards by the U.S. Constitution, Fifth Amendment, which provides that private property should not be taken for public use without just compensation. So we are always cognizant as attorneys advising municipalities that there are limits to the regulatory action a land use board can take, and a regulation that so severely impacts the use of property that it constitutes, in effect, a regulatory taking could create circumstances where just compensation has to be paid. So recognizing there are inherent limitations set forth constitutionally in the regulatory process of approving with conditions, conditional use permits would be something to be cognizant of. Next slide, please. So the New Hampshire Supreme Court taking standards most recently have been found in the Boulders of Stratford LLC versus the town of Stratford. And so what the court currently uses as a standard for addressing whether a taking has occurred is first to understand that the Zoning Enabling Act gives the municipalities broad authority to pass zoning ordinances to protect health, safety, morals, and general welfare. So to determine whether an ordinance is a proper exercise of the town's police power or the city's police power, you have to withstand a substantive due process challenge, a challenge suggesting that an action taken by a land use board was a regulatory taking. The question is whether the decision was based upon a rational basis or a rational basis test. So that inquiry employs the lowest constitutional scrutiny and asks whether the ordinance constitutes a restriction on property rights that is rationally related to the municipality's legitimate goals, which is a fairly light level of constitutional analysis, but it's still something to keep in mind in assessing, whether in a particular set of circumstances, a wetland regulation as applied to a particular property exceeds what in our state court assessment is the rational basis test. But probably more important, next slide, please, is the U.S. Supreme Court taking standards. And I think, next slide, please, is set forth in Palazzo versus the Rhode Island. So there's a lot of details here and how the Supreme Court has given you some guidance on what is considered in certain circumstances to be a regulatory taking. But I think the easiest to understand is probably the first requirement, a regulation that denies all economically beneficial or productive use of the land could require just compensation. So, you know, when a regulation places limits falling short of eliminating all economically beneficial use, a taking nonetheless could still occur, and it really requires a, you know, assessment of a complex set of factors, you know, the economic effect on the landowner, the extent of the regulation interferes with reasonable investment-backed expectations, and the character of the government action. Those are all variables that have to be taken into account. And so there's no kind of one bright line rule that says this is a taking, this isn't a taking. So as the court said in that case, these inquiries are informed by the process of the purpose of the takings clause, which is to prevent government from forcing people alone to bear public burdens, which in all fairness and justice should be borne by the public as a whole. So I you know, just point these limitations out, recognizing that, you know, in every set of circumstances where someone might come before the planning board to get a CUP for a wetland impact, you just have to judge the degree to which, you know, not granting the permission may have such a severe, potentially severe impact on the reasonable investment expectations of the property owner to make use of their property. And it's just a balancing of the potential harm, and I'm sure Sandy can point out, you know, to the particular wetland that's being impacted or affected. And, you know, what is the public safety, health, and welfare benefit from protecting that particular a wetland area, as opposed to, you know, what is the denial or deprivation of the use of that property by the landowner. And, you know, there's really no clear, you know, line to say this is a taking versus this isn't. Yes? You have a hand up?
Yeah, go back about 6 or 8 sentences. You kind of basically said, well, if it's economically not feasible to do anything except for build there, economics aren't part of this. I mean, if the site has to be suitable, you can't build in the buffer.
Well, all I would say is that I don't know that I can give you a algorithm that says in all circumstances, you know, if you make a judgment that a wetland has paramount importance under all circumstances, that's always going to be a sufficient basis to say that is a reason alone to deny the ability of a landowner to make use of their property.
But economic benefits simply, you know, you got to tell the developer you can make this building smaller and keep it the heck out of the buffer. And they say, well, then it's not a viable project. Well, that's not our problem. You shouldn't have proposed it.
Well, and I'm not going to say that a statement alone by a developer that it's not a viable project is alone sufficient to say, well, they're correct, therefore you have to grant the CUP. I think it's a balance, you know, and you have to assess what is the degree of the impact. I mean, I think, you know, there was one case a number of years ago, Roe versus the town of Northampton, where the property was subject to a very significant wetland conservation area. And in that case, which I'm not sure would be an outcome today, when the property owner wanted to develop the one lot they had for as one single-family home, they were just denied and told that the property, it can be used for wetland protection, but not necessarily for the building of a home. Now, whether that was justified based upon the impact that would have been brought to that property from that house and the particular wetlands that were being potentially harmed, I can't say. But I can say this.
That sounds very subjective, where when you read there is no alternative location outside the wetland buffer that is feasible or reasonable for the proposed use, activity, or alteration. That doesn't sound subjective.
Well, are you reading from
our ordinance? Your
ordinance, okay, I'm sorry. But I think that it's still ultimately a balancing that the board has to undertake, a balancing of the impact on the property owner versus the unique area that's being protected. I mean, if I understand a little bit about wetland ordinances and what they're designed to do. If you have a wetland that has high functions and values, that it's extremely valuable, you might have more flexibility to say that has to be better protected. That's less likely we're going to grant that permission to build into the buffer or build into that particular wetland.
But we don't have to grant it.
Well, I think you then have to balance what is the impact on that particular wetland, and if the amount of the building that's being proposed would impact a very significant wetland, you might be able to say either you reduce the site of the building, get out of the buffer, or get out of the wetland, or you don't build at all. So I think it really depends upon that balancing. How important of a wetland structure is being protected versus the impact, the economic impact on the person who's proposing the project. Yes.
So you could, if it's, talking about a building being a small amount or some small amount, not like the whole building, but a portion of it, being in a buffer, there could be mitigating factors that help protect the wetland through the buffer that could be required in order to say you meet the criteria.
And there could be ways in which the building could be modified in terms of its design to minimize that impact. So I'm not here to say that there's, every permit that is proposed, if it has an impact, can't be approved if they can't achieve no impact at all. I don't think I think the balancing process you're supposed to go through and make these decisions.
That's why you have the CUP.
I think there's a disconnect with our ordinance, though. I think our ordinance is very constraining because it provides the 6 criteria. They are given as absolutes. You shall comply with all 6. The list of uses that can go into the wetlands buffer are in 10.10.16. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that. And they're very limited. And buildings are not part of those, except for single-family dwellings. Now, that aside, I think the reality here in Portsmouth, we have some sites that are dirty. They've suffered some environmental damage over the years, and we've had developers propose to do significant cleanup. And there's been a conflict because the damage has been within the buffer areas and outside the buffer areas. And so, as a trade with the city, they want to sometimes encroach on the wetlands buffer with their buildings, but they're proposing significant environmental cleanup, which is an overall benefit. I think our ordinance constrains us from doing that because of the way it's written, but from the greater perspective of public policy, maybe it should be revised to allow that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would beg off trying to give you specific advice on how you would achieve a different approach to wetland regulation. I'm not in a position here to really guide, changes, because I know you're already dealing with a number of other zoning changes to your ordinance, and either making it more flexible or more protective of wetlands. So I would defer.
As a general matter of good zoning policy, would it make sense to have an ordinance that does give some discretion, ability for the city to allow for environmental enhancement that may otherwise, in an area that was not damaged, you're not going to impact a prime wetland, but that same setback distance might apply in the damaged site. So maybe there needs to be some flexibility. And there's lots of hands up, and I don't want to dominate this.
Yeah, no, I just actually wanted to comment on what you said, because I've been a member of the Conservation Commission for 30 years. And I think that what we do when we allow a conditional use permit, particularly in some of the sites that I think you're referencing, is based on the fact that the area is not protected at the moment, and there is significant impact to, or they're going to clean it up anyway, So we have, I think, consistently made the decision that it's going to be better, even though you're encroaching on the buffer afterward, than it is now. And that's how we make our decisions, I think.
I think that's in the greater scheme of things, I think that's a good decision. I don't think that's the way the ordinance is written. And I know there's some disagreement on that. Thank you, Pat.
To that point, sometimes nature takes care of things in a better way than when man interferes with their cleanup. So I just want to make that point. And I don't think that the city of Portsmouth has actually respected that aspect enough. And that's why we're sort of in these developmental arguments. But also, I had a question. What about the motivation? I understand some of the zoning was probably written or geared for people who had a property, been in the family for 50, 100 years, whatever, and suddenly they have to adjust to sort of the modern world and what is expected of them environmentally. However, what about somebody who knows that their property is in the buffer zone, it should be non-buildable, and yet they go and buy it with the idea that they're going to build and they're going to get something passed through all the boards, and they decide that. So is there any kind of legal I'm asking the board, shouldn't that be a consideration of what was the incentive or what was the motivation? And should that be something that actually Portsmouth will say, hey, well, you bought this in the last 2 years, you knew it was in the buffer zone. No, you don't get to do this. Even if it, and also about the 6 criteria, I have to say, I have heard arguments for the exact same property where each side gives their 6 criteria why it does not conform and why it does conform. So it's kind of like the Supreme Court in that, oh yeah, it's the law. No, it's your own beliefs that interfere that affect these 6 criteria. You were saying it's it is not. You can always figure out a way. It's like you can always work the numbers to make it say what you want. So I have issues with that, and that's how Portsmouth is making their decisions, because it depends who's on the board and who, what connections the developers come in, what allies they have, and anyway, I'll stop now.
Let me just say that when you look at a situation where someone comes to a limitation, that is, they buy into a property that has inherent limitations, that can certainly be taken in as a factor. On the other hand, just because a property has pre-existing environmental constraints doesn't mean that the prior property owner or the current property owner may still have some legitimate not economic-based expectations to use the property for purposes allowed under the zoning ordinance. And yes, it's limited by the zoning ordinance because it has a wetland area on it, or it's within the buffer. So I wouldn't say it's, just because I buy into a situation, I'm totally precluded from being able to use that property. I still might have some reasonable basis to proceed with some kind of use of the land reasonably under the ordinance, but it certainly would be something you could take into account in addressing someone's application that they knew when they purchased that it had these inherent environmental or wetland limitations.
And often they purchase at a reduced price because it is a constrained property. That's another thing that comes up.
So if they buy at a reduced price and they have a condition is financial in nature to going in, then it's challenge.
Follow the money.
Yeah,
They want more money
they want more
regardless
money.
of how much they
But
pay
the
for it.
condition says you can't be making more money.
I think we're talking about, innovative land use. That's what a conditional use permit is. That's where we all started. And it makes it and the whole reason these things were put in place was for more flexibility. So you say black and white criteria. I say there might be a mitigating factor that makes it actually reach that criteria. And so there lies our own personal opinions. So in the end, I see our and I've always seen my job as a land use board member for the now close to a decade I've been doing this, is that it does matter this property going forward. We've always talked about, it doesn't matter who owns it at the time, it matters what's going to be put there, what can we put in place for the long term, no matter who owns the property. And that it's better for Portsmouth as a whole. That's the improvement that we're looking for, but that's just my 2 cents.
And just to be clear, I agree there should be some flexibility, but I don't think it's in there right now. And I've written a lot of these regulations myself. It's easy to change. And I just think it needs to be changed, that's all.
That's phase 3 of our zoning changes under our plan and land use, but
We'll get
doesn't look
there.
like we're going to get there
We'll get
anytime
there.
soon.
Sorry, Attorney Buckley.
I really had nothing further to add unless you had more questions to ask of me, but that's the last of the slides I had, and I certainly would be happy to let Sandy give her view of some of these issues under the wetland conditional use permit.
you're talking about the things that I was going to.
Sorry, we're jumping ahead, aren't we?
Which is fine. Everybody's
She knows she can
revved-
just jump into it.
revved up to on this topic. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, I also bring 20 years on a planning board to my DES experience, so I'm familiar with a lot of these issues. So next slide, please. I'm going to review in a slightly different way the CUP authority for wetlands. I'm going to talk about buffers in general, talk about some DES-related permitting aspects. Then we'll talk about the CUP criteria for approval. There are a couple of things that I thought that might be helpful for additional protection, and then I'm sure we'll have discussion throughout. Okay, next slide, please.
Judging from us so far.
Right. So this slide actually kind of reviews a lot of what Steve mentioned about the authority, the CUP authority from the RSA, and that the planning board, when they administer it and such. So we sort of went through this. So next slide. So the authority for the wetland CUP comes from the zoning ordinance, and the zoning ordinance is dependent upon the adoption of a master plan, which of course Portsmouth has. Next slide. So in your master plan, in the resilient goals section, I noted at least 2 goals that relate to zoning and wetlands that I've listed here. One is about implementing BMP's best management practices and site design standards relative to public and private infrastructure, and infrastructure can be green infrastructure. And then the sub-goal of 5.3, promoting effective stewardship of the city's natural resources, that by planning properly or permitting things is a way to steward properties that may not be owned by the city but are within the city boundaries. Next slide. Thank you. So this is in this section that you're probably more than familiar with. It outlines the purposes for the wetland protection requirements, thus essentially describing the functions and values that wetlands provide. Next slide. And in section 10.1014.20, it more specifically mentions the protections that wetland buffers provide to the wetlands. Next slide. So there have been many studies and many literature reviews of studies to try and identify what buffer widths are effective to meet various objectives. Kind of melding the science and implementation of the science is the challenge. So the 2 graphics here are from 2 sources that assembled information from literature reviews. And what's interesting, the one at the left is from 1997, and the buffer options for the bay is from 2018. So they're like more than 20 years apart. And basically, it's hard to read the buffer options on the bay, but if you look on the graphic, basically they're very similar in terms of in the range of minimum widths. Water quality concerns are typically addressed with buffers that are smaller than those that address wildlife concerns. So The water quality issues, while it depends very site-specifically on, and we'll talk about that more, on slope and soils and such, and type of vegetation, basically water quality buffers are on the lower end and wildlife buffers are on the bigger end. And, you know, then this doesn't even bring in some of the vernal pools where you have wildlife that, you know, moves like a quarter of a mile to the vernal pool. So it goes well in excess of the 300 feet that's shown here. Next slide. So for wildlife, buffers are actually core habitat. It's not like the extra stuff around the edge. And there was a great study done that's buffer zones and beyond, and it was done actually in Massachusetts and with a New England focus. And basically they looked at the 4 different groups of wildlife: reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and birds, and looked at those that use upland and wetlands and what parts they use. And so, you know, 77% use areas from the wetland edge to 100 feet. So you're really encompassing a lot. But then you also see that, you know, beyond 100 feet to 200 and beyond, you have 50% of the wildlife that's using those areas. So the wildlife needs are much greater in terms of buffer width than the water quality needs. Next slide. So much of this research is contributed clearly to the wetland buffer approach that's used in Portsmouth. And so this is a great graphic that has been produced locally for that. Next slide. So in most New Hampshire communities, buffers are only protected under local regulation. But due to Portsmouth's tidal and coastal location, because the state of New Hampshire under RSA 42A has tidal buffer zone, and then also the timing of Portsmouth's adoption of prime wetlands made it one of the few communities with prime wetland buffers subject to DES permitting. Essentially, the prime wetlands part of the wetlands law used to say adjacent, and it gave DES the flexibility to say, okay, if it's a significant impact, you know, look at a wider area for adjacent, and if it was a really minimal impact, look at something smaller. So people didn't like that, so they said, okay, let's put in a 100-foot buffer. So then a 100-foot buffer was put into the law. That's when Portsmouth adopted the prime wetland buffers, or prime wetlands. And then at some later time, the law was kind of chipped away, and they took out DES's authority for buffers, but anybody that adopted in that certain time frame still has buffers protected under that prime wetlands part of the wetlands law. The prime wetlands report that's produced as part of the study and designation process actually provides significant information about the functions and values for which they were designated, and that's something that should always be referred to when looking at potential impacts to buffers to prime wetlands. Next slide. So returning back to the zoning ordinance, these are the 6 criteria for approval of a wetland CUP. And as we discussed already, basically all of the criteria listed have to be met. So we'll go through, let's, next slide. So what are the first criterion is the land is reasonably suited to the use, activity, or alteration. in my thought, it would be, does the land fit the activity, use, or alteration being proposed? What are the resources potentially affected by the activity? Does a parcel pose significant constraints due to natural features, such as ledge, wetland, or streams, or existing development, such as including utility rights of way? Other considerations is what is the condition of the buffer, and what are the functions and values of the wetland? As we've sort of alluded to, there's recognition that some of the best land has been developed already, and so what is currently undeveloped often has constraints that may not be suited to a proposed intensity of use. So and this is where we're talking about, not everything is black and white. You have land that it may have been disturbed. I don't want to say that if it's disturbed, well, then we can impact the buffer, because I've always thought, well, let's restore it, which actually I think that's included in the options as well. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so there's criteria number 2. There's no alternative location outside the wetland buffer that is feasible and reasonable for the proposed use, activity, or alteration. So the rest of your zoning ordinance should, to some extent, define some of what would be allowed in the general area. And then looking at the constraints, some lots may have been developed with a buffer on most of the parcel. So I think you have both areas where the land is totally undeveloped, and then you have areas where you have a parcel that's partially used, that maybe someone has a house and they want to put on a garage, maybe a pool, things where, you're probably not going to move to a new location to put on the garage unless clearly there's a significant impact, in the buffer. Some lots have, we talked about, may have a buffer that covers everything except the main structure. So the alternative location or no alternative location is something where, you have to look, is what's requested something that's whether it says feasible and reasonable. With a lot of the wetlands permitting that DES does, they typically wouldn't let a house fill a wetland, or for the construction of a house, you couldn't fill a wetland, but the bigger the footprint you have, the less likely you're going to have a parcel that has no wetlands on it. So I think that it's that type of thought process that you might want to consider when you look at projects. I know some projects are more flexible than others. All right. Next slide. Okay. Criterion 3. There will be no adverse impact on the wetland functional values of the site or surrounding properties. So I know that not all of your buffer impacts, I know that there are criteria for when a functional assessment has to be done. But I would encourage you to really look closely and critically at the functional assessment and whether it was really used to design the project. Sometimes it's like, okay, well, let's check the box. We did the functional assessment, but it really wasn't used in the design of the project. So I think that's really important. And I think that You sometimes do have peer reviews of the wetland delineations, and I would encourage, for some projects where you have concerns, that you do peer reviews of the functional assessment, because I see things in functional assessments that are incorrect, that understate impacts.
Sandy, quick question.
Sure.
In the new DES rules, they built upon the functional assessment, correct? Like, you have to, there's a whole section that requires.
Right.
So in other words, if we're considering a CUP that requires a DES wetland standard dredge and fill, they're having to go through that functional assessment.
They do have to do a functional assessment.
Which is kind of above and beyond what they used to have to, or is it?
Right, they did, excuse me, they only had to do it for like a major impact project before. Also, under the old rules, they had those 20 questions.
Right.
That
Yep.
were sort of, to some extent, looking at things that you would look at in a functional assessment, or kind of an impact analysis based upon, functions
Right.
and values.
Okay.
But Sandy, is your point also that whoever's presenting the analysis of those, the functional assessment might want to have a peer review of that because you've seen some discrepancies?
Yeah, I think sometimes that there are, that for some projects, and I would probably say either for larger projects or for projects that are, I don't know, maybe, and it's really hard to say since you have some significant habitat here with the tidal environment, is just, I would say definitely if it's a more pristine, an undeveloped parcel that they're going and developing. There are also, I have a recommendation later on about something that would talk about here, but I think really looking at, with the functional assessment also, when they, and I know some of these criteria seem to overlap a little bit. Because.
Can I just add a point? In our ordinance, we do require, depending on the size of the impact and whether it's in the buffer or the wetland, we do require different levels of review or of analysis by the consultant. So it is in there to some degree.
Okay, well, I know you do require functional assessment except
on a bigger
for
project.
some of the really smallest impact areas. I did see that. I'd say also, was the project designed to consider results and include considerations beyond dimensional considerations? Because very often consultants are very tied to, okay, you say it's a X feet buffer, or we know that it's going to go to DES, so we're going to make sure we make the, culverts or stream crossings that will go through them, but they may not really look at the resources that they're really potentially impacting beyond that sometimes. That's what I've observed. Let's see. And then, is there restoration proposed as part of the project that improves any decreased function from the existing disturbance? So there could be existing disturbance on the property, and while the project may have some impacts in the buffer, what they're doing helps restores some of the function that was not there before. And I know also included in that would be like if you remove impervious surfaces or pavement and return that to vegetation, that may offset any potential adverse impact that's done someplace else. Next slide. So alteration of the natural vegetative state or managed woodland will occur only to the extent necessary to achieve construction goals. From what I saw, it seems to focus on impacts to the more natural vegetated habitats and minimizing those impacts. And I think for something like this, a project proponent should demonstrate appropriate restoration of temporary impacts. And I don't know, I know that you're lucky that you have staff. I don't know, do you all do site walks for projects?
Yes.
All projects
Not
typically?
every project, no.
Not all of them?
Limited.
Okay. It's a good thing to do, but I'm sure that it's a busy place here to try and do all of that. I'm having trouble just scheduling things with my own little Conservation Commission. Okay, all right. So some of these, like I said, we talk about whether it's pristine or disturbed. Do you have invasive species that should be removed? All kind of considerations in the whether the vegetation is altered or to what extent. Next slide. So the proposal is the alternative with the least adverse impact to areas and environments under the jurisdiction of this section. And I know this is kind of what was raised earlier. It's really tough. It's always kind of a balancing of, you know, what are the resources we have, what is the proposed development, how well they mesh with all the information we have from the functional assessment. Did they really consider the resources once again, or did they just kind of, okay, well, we kind of squeeze things down so we impact less of the wetland or less of the buffer? But this really should be, should rely a lot on the functional assessment and how the results are once again reflected in the design of the projects. You know, different construction techniques, adjustments for any time of year concerns such as high flows or mud season or when animals may migrate. Is, you know, and I know that you all look at this use of pervious pavement where that's an option. And is there, once again, restoration proposed that improves the functions of the buffer or wetland to offset other proposed impacts? Because in some areas that would be a significant benefit.
This criteria, all the things you said, I agree with, but the way that's worded, this proposal is the alternative to the least adverse impact. It doesn't say anything about considering those other criteria, and it could. It could say this proposal, on balance with the following criteria, results in a net benefit impact. It doesn't say that. It says least adverse. That's a very strict standard.
That's, I think, well, it's probably comparable to like DES has least impacting alternatives. I mean, that's kind of the terminology, and it's always a balancing of, well, what is the least impacting alternative? When somebody comes in and wants, 30 houses in a development, and you're saying, we really probably should be more like 20. Well, I think the consultants tend to look at the dimensions, what you require, and the size, and the buffer, and everything, and, they're kind of all set. But I think you need to make sure that you have, beyond this, not prescriptive criteria, but kind of like including or and whether you have options for saying that, buffers to certain resources or impacts to the buffer may not be permitted, or, there are some, if you make it specific enough that there's, and I know Steve was talking about, there's a reason for why you need to protect something more. You have the information, that's where the functional assessment, do you have, if it's a DES permitted thing, do you have the Natural Heritage Bureau data check? Do you know that there are rare species there? It's not just you've impacted the buffer a little bit, and so that's not the least impacting alternative. Barbara?
I was going to say, once you get more prescriptive, I think your hands are more tied than anything, because you can't guess at every single possible scenario.
I'm not suggesting that.
No, I know, but once you go down that path, you end up paying for it later, because you don't have the developers, whoever it is that's coming to you, the homeowner, are going to push it as far as they can. And you no longer have that discrepancy to make decisions based on being a little vague on it in our regulations. And I think DES has run into that too. Once you get into like mitigation and things like that, you start to make it easier for them and harder for us to be flexible, to be in both cases, to help them out or whatever. So I think it's a dangerous path to go down. I really do.
Well, I'm open to the conversation. I think I said something, I think I heard something a little bit different than what Sandy was saying. What I'm saying is that this is a constraining bit of language that the city isn't following, in my opinion. What I heard you say was that on a certain site, you may have a site with, say, an amoebic form of buffers that can be mapped perfectly by all the consultants, and have it impacted up to its edges along the entire perimeter of all that. But then find out that those particular wetlands on this particular site have some really special species and habitat that, it's unique. So perhaps, even though they've met all the dimensional criteria, that shouldn't be permitted in that instance. Did I hear that correctly? Was that
Well, I was talking, well, that would be, if your CUP addresses buffers and wetlands, then things beyond the buffer and wetland may not be under your purview. I mean, the Conservation Commission, the CUP purview, it could be under the Planning Board's purview under their regulations. And I don't, because you're talking about things that are not in wetland.
I thought you were alluding to that with talking about the quality of the, and the functional assessment in certain sites having a higher functional value, and therefore they needed more protection. Maybe I misheard it.
Right. I was thinking in terms of whether an impact to a buffer was something that would be a valid consideration versus whether it is a valid consideration because the resources aren't that significant in that area, or whether it's you wouldn't want to give a CUP for a buffer impact because the resources are high value. Did I just say that twice?
I'm wondering why you think that that's restrictive, because to me that phrase is, it lets you incorporate a multitude of things. It is not telling you what to incorporate. So you can say, oh, this is an incredibly diverse wetlands area, say, with lots of species, or there's some road impact or something. I mean, it seems, I don't understand why this seems restrictive to you. And can you
Okay,
explain?
here's let's
I don't know,
let's
are other people having the same questions?
just do this quickly. Let's assume the whole here is our wetlands buffer, and here's a building, and I want to do that. I'm a developer now, and I say I want to do that. When I could do this, and it would fit.
Right.
I say that says I have to do this.
Well,
But all I have to do is shift it out. But I've seen proposals that do this.
right. So, are you saying, so what if pulling it back actually helps other things? Or what if putting it in actually helps other land? This way, you guys, or us, whatever, can decide what's going to have the least impact. So that's why I don't understand.
Because as soon as I cross that line, I'm affecting it. If I get out of it, I'm not affecting it. So therefore, this, by definition, has the least impact.
But that building may
necessarily.
have other
No,
things that need to go with
no
it.
wetlands over here.
Right, but that building may need to have other things that go with it that can't fit.
Doesn't say that.
Well, that doesn't,
It's, if it's out of the wetlands, it's a zoning thing anyway. So, but we're talking about when it is in the
I'm
wetlands.
saying,
Then
all I'm saying
it's
is
like,
this, that
is it
says,
that, or is it that, or is it, something that? I mean,
yeah. The other thing is if that buffer is, impacted already, if you, as part of it, you might do some restoration rather than just put the building in. You could put the building out of it and then kind of go, I'm not going to do anything to that buffer. That hands off.
that's what I said earlier, and I think we could say that we don't. It doesn't say that, and I think it should. Peter?
Can I add something to that? I guess if you look at criteria 3, though, it kind of ties it in, and it's not taking every one individually, but taking them all as all 6 criteria that you have to look at. And if you think about that building getting pushed in, yeah, if it was nothing more than a construction project and in one point in time, and you put the building in, then yeah, clearly, that's not the least impacting component. It's less impacting to keep that building out. When you put that building in, but then you do some restoration on the site, then your functions and values are going to adapt to that, and you're going to have a better function and value picture at the end. So what you're trying to do is look at the whole picture, and at the end, have you balanced that? By putting that building in, have you created a balance somewhere else on the site? And I do think this gives us that flexibility. I'm sure it could be worded better, I agree. But I think that if you go back to criteria 3, where you're looking at the functions of the site, and think about the functions of that building going in, by itself, it might be not the least impacting component, but with the other measures that someone might take, like pulling Phragmites out of the buffer, or turning impervious surface into porous pavement or something like that, then I think you can get to that balancing. At least that's how.
I think we're on the same page.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of perhaps refining the language a little bit.
Yeah,
I agree with everything everybody wants to do and see an end result. I just don't think that the ordinance does it. That's all.
okay. Yeah, I was just curious about your question about the language, so.
Yeah, and I wouldn't read criterion 5 as sort of being a dimensional least impact. I would think that would also take into account the functions and values.
Right.
Well, see, here's the point. There are cases where the developer will say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do all these other wonderful things. That's great. You could still do all those other wonderful things and do this. That's my point. That would be even better.
Right,
So,
okay. So that's the least, that would be the least impact, though.
But
Wouldn't it? Indeed.
we have no ability to have them continue to do all those good things if they're out of the buffer. That's right.
well, actually, I think there are ways to do that. But anyway, we're getting off track here.
Right.
Sorry.
All right, next slide. So this is the last criterion. Any area within the vegetated buffer strip will be returned to a natural state to the extent feasible. So I think this criterion is somewhat more of a condition, recognizes the importance of the upland area nearest to the resource, the wetland or stream, which is especially valuable when vegetated, in particular for water quality. So, it'd be things like, making sure that any lawn area is converted to natural plantings, removal of invasive species, because I think the natural state is a natural, non-invasive state, definitely. So next, slide. So this is just, all 6 criteria that are there that we've gone through. And next slide. So the point I also wanted to make, and we've talked about some of these, the challenge is that the criteria require balancing of existing conditions, unique and different natural resource sites, and a wide variety of proposed projects in those varied and unique environments and disturbance conditions. And then when you have a lot of flexibility in the criteria, you talk about things being reasonably suited, feasible and reasonable, no adverse impacts, a little more narrow, to the extent necessary, least adverse impact, to the extent feasible. So there's really a lot of leeway in these and a lot of, judgment that needs to be, decisions need to be made backed by information. So it's a challenge. I mean, this is something that at DES and wetland permitting, always, they used to have the requirement for the need for the project, and people used to joke that it was a I want it, not I need it. that often happened. The next slide. So a couple of additional considerations for wetland resource protection. I think you may want to consider requiring the Natural Heritage Bureau data check report for any buffer-only impacts. If it goes to DES for permitting, the data check report is required. That is identifying any of the tracked species or exemplary natural communities, if they're in the vicinity and they have certain vicinities that they use for different species. That information would be helpful to really assess that functions and values information that's provided. Also, I don't know to the extent that Portsmouth has a lot of intermittent streams, but if you do, you may want to add them as a jurisdictional resource, because it is a jurisdictional resource for DES, and having some of those things consistent would be good. It's as the cartoon says, we're small, but we do big jobs. What is it? I don't even.
Big chores.
Big chores. Yes, thank you. I don't have it memorized, but it's people tend to think bigger is better, bigger is more important. They think bigger wetlands are more important. Bigger wetlands do a lot of things in a big way, but some of the intermittent streams, they're where wetlands or streams are subject to the kind of a wet-dry cycle. That's when you have more nutrients, particularly like nitrogen, removed from the water. And so those are the things that people think are, oh, gee, it's not really wet very often. Well, things that are wet all the time don't remove nitrogen. It's that wet-dry cycle that the microorganisms remove the nitrogen. So that is what I have. The next slide, and just kind of questions and discussion beyond what we've covered.
Thank you.
Sandy?
Mm-hmm.
In your experience, I take it you've reviewed many municipal CUP ordinances and requirements. Are Portsmouth 6 standard, or they have common themes, or how would you rate our 6 criteria? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, I don't actually, I think when I've looked at a lot of people's CUPs, I've done more at the front end because they didn't define wetlands correctly, or they thought that they had streams covered, but they didn't, because streams are, so I can't say that I've looked at the approval criteria. I think some of them are similar, but I think that, it's kind of, I don't have that approval criteria kind of in my mind that I can remember.
Okay, so, but the process is similar, though. I mean, the criteria different municipalities use for their CUPs, it's a similar stepwise process. They usually have one or more criteria you have to meet.
Right, yeah. I mean, I'm familiar with like the town of Bow, and there are, a bunch of different criteria, and they're also very kind of I think there might be a, least adverse impact one, and, a lot of things that once, just require a lot of balancing. And do you agree with the information that's presented, or what information you have? Is that consistent? And,
Okay, thanks.
Barbara?
I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, but we run into, for number 2, the alternatives outside the buffer being feasible and reasonable. Other regulations, local regulations, creating obstacles for that to be feasible, like setbacks and so, and lately with accessory dwelling units, there's certain regulations that they have to position the building in a certain place that creates sort of a problem there. So is there any kind of protocol on that, or it just probably must depend on so many things?
Well, I guess I guess it sort of depends both how often it comes up. I mean, there are things that until Town of Bow, for instance, put shared driveways as okay for up to 3 houses. You had to go to the ZBA and get approval for a shared driveway. And, there have been times when the planning board has said, we support this, but you have to go to the ZBA and get that addressed. So they may not want to go to the ZBA. But, and I guess if you see things coming up a lot, then that's something that you need to kind of figure out how to address. But I have not seen a whole lot of that recently, or...
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I don't know if they can hear us, but there's 3 people on Zoom. I think the city manager, Samantha Collins, and who was the other one? Ted. And Ted Jankowski. Just wanted to let you know that they're there in case they had questions.
Are they raising their hands?
Can I ask one more question? So one of the things the commission has been interested in the past, and I don't want to go too far beyond the wetlands or wetland buffer, but is upland habitat and upland wildlife protection. But if we keep it to the buffer even, is there, I appreciate the recommendation about the data check, but that's a data check on data that's known, that's out there. Is there any process like a wetland functional value assessment for a wetland scientist or an upland scientist of some sort to look for habitat that might be unique or special in the buffer that's beyond the scope of a wetland review? Because the wetland functional value assessment is very focused on the wetland area, but if we're protecting the buffer, maybe there's other things in that buffer that aren't being looked at that have some value, like nesting habitat or other wildlife corridors, things like that. Is there any process that you've heard of or know of that communities have used to try to look beyond just the wetland functional value itself, but into the habitat of the upland area adjacent to it?
Right. I can't think of anything offhand now. The Natural Heritage Bureau data check will have upland as well as wetland exemplary natural communities. So you will know about that. The other thing is, any adjacent communities, what exemplary natural communities do they have that could be in yours that you're not aware of?
What about the wildlife action plan? Because that encompasses some bigger areas.
Right. They do have kind of like a predicted habitat for a variety of species. So you may look at that. And I guess the other thing would be to, if you had good information on that upland habitat, if even someone wanted to say, it, you know, probably not random, but like, you know, oak pine forest or, you know, whatever, they could, that would be helpful in identifying potential habitats or things that are around. The Natural Heritage Bureau has some documents that they've done on basically, you know, identifying the natural communities. And so those natural communities are not, you know, all the some of them would be exemplary, but they're just basically characterizing the type of community it is. I know that there had been, the Natural Heritage Bureau was trying to get DES to kind of require that as part of some of their work, but it hasn't quite gotten there. But that is another way. You could ask for information on, you know, characterize the upland according to the, you know, Natural Heritage Bureau's Natural Communities Guidance.
Oh, okay. So that wouldn't be available necessarily, but it's something that maybe your wetland scientist would do as part of the inventory of the site? In the application process?
Right, they could, because basically it looks at, it is basically plant-based, but if you had that information, you know, Fish and Game could probably tell you what species, or using the Wildlife Action Plan, what species would likely be found in those types of habitats.
Great, thank you.
When I read the stuff, you know, the submissions that come in, and there's the, like you had somebody had mentioned, the checkoff for like endangered species, you know, does it include, you know, have these been, the sturgeon or whatever have been found? But I'm always sort of like, okay, so you have to wait till a species is basically on the edge before you consider habitat for it, and are we, you know, slowly but surely, you know, by not including all species, threatened or not, are we just destroying the habitat so nothing's going to be there in, you know, 10,
the Wildlife
10
Action
years.
Plan.
So is there anything that I mean, the buffer zone is only 100 feet, and that's pretty unsubstantial, really, when you're talking wildlife, as our things have shown, and how many other states are adopting much larger buffer zones because of that stuff, but New Hampshire's not moving on that, I don't think. But is there, I mean,
yeah, well, the Wildlife Action Plan, one of the kind of little things that they say, quotes, is, you know, trying to keep common species common.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know, is there a deer yard on the property? You know, that's something that, you know, is a feature you might want to protect if it isn't, you know, called out.
So does that make sense as if we're, you know, board members thinking about that, even though it's not in the documentation that's being fed to us?
Well, you know, I mean, I fully understand what you're saying and agree that, you know, we don't know where everything is. You know, it may not get reported. I had somebody tell me, I just saw my first Blanding's turtle. And I said, did you take a photo of it? No. It's like, I mean, it's good also, I don't know whether you've seen, Fish and Game has developed whole wildlife corridors that they've modeled, and it might be good to look at that and see how that comes up for properties, either for conservation planning or for other things. And, you know, you make it known, put it on your website and just link to it, and, that may be something to consider. I mean, if you don't specifically spell out wildlife corridors, in your ordinance or some aspects like that, that may be something you want to look at.
Sandy, just I know that time is getting towards the end, but real briefly, and this could be a huge whole presentation. Could you just for everybody's knowledge, a lot of times we have applications come in front of us, and oh yeah, we're getting our DES permits, but not everybody's aware of just kind of the new, there's basically three major permits I'm thinking of. You have your AOT, you have your shoreland, and you have your wetland standard dredge and fill. Can you just, without going into major, minor, and minimum and all that, can you just kind of quickly go over, what the difference between those three are, so that when board members or, people hear, oh yeah, we're getting an AOT, oh no, we don't need an AOT, but we need a shoreland, kind of where those jurisdictions
Sure, okay.
fall.
Alteration of terrain addresses primarily stormwater, both quantity and quality. If you impact 100,000 square feet of land, or if it's within shoreland, if it's 50,000 square feet, you have to submit an alteration of terrain permit. The alteration of terrain permits, I can't remember whether it's since 2019 when they changed their rules, but they actually have a kind of a wildlife habitat assessment that's now part of that. So that's alteration of terrain. They have a time frame in which they have to do their review and respond. So sometimes it's pretty quick and what have you, but and then they give developers like 4 months or 3 months for a response because of, often it's a lot of the engineering or redoing things, possibly. So the front part of it is a short time frame, but then the response from the applicants are a little bit longer. Shoreland protection is RSA 483B, and that addresses vegetation and kind of disturbance within, I'm still thinking it's 250 feet from the various, I don't want to say water's edge, but they're, specific reference lines. And within certain zones, you can cut only a certain amount of trees. There are points for to figure out how much trees you can cut and what you can do on the site. And DES does overlap, like if you need a shoreline and wetlands permit, they've been trying to coordinate them. I'm not sure where that process is. And then, the wetlands permit is RSA 42A, and it's been in place since 1967 for tidal wetlands. We kind of preceded the Federal Clean Water Act. And then it was expanded to 1969 for freshwater wetlands. And so that's there's no minimum impact for wetland disturbance. There are some types of projects that are covered under a statutory permit by notification. There's, for forestry that's not pre-development. There's, the docks are under the wetlands permitting. They do have a classification for minimum, minor, major, and major projects start at 10,000 square feet, and so that's the point at which also mitigation is required, which would be either wetland restoration, or typically wetland creation is really not in the cards, or contribution to the ARM fund if they can't identify a restoration opportunity. So that's
And
it.
then just on, and then the U.S. Army Corps gets to review
The Corps,
all
yes.
those.
In New Hampshire, New Hampshire has what's called a programmatic general permit with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So the Corps has to issue permits, under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And so since New Hampshire has a program, New Hampshire basically issues virtually all the permits for the state of New Hampshire, and the Corps kind of does oversight. They'll review. They have greater jurisdiction in some areas, and EPA reviews. They look at secondary impacts, so it doesn't have to be direct impact, not just direct wetland impact that they look at. So there are some other things that they look at. So that's where the Corps of Engineers and EPA kind of has somewhat of a role in there.
Thanks.
It sort of sounds like DES and the planning board share the same roles. In other words, DES is trying to protect wetlands. Our conditional use permit wants us to do the same thing. Do we ever dovetail? In other words, so if there's a battle over a conditional use permit in Portsmouth, and let's see, it's not appealed within 30 days, its only recourse is state court. But why isn't DES involved, or are they, with us in this process?
Well, there's, if there's a wetland impact or an impact to a jurisdictional area that DES has, the Conservation Commission has a statutory advisory role that they can provide comment to DES within a certain time frame on that wetlands application. You'd be following or whatever the DES rules are, saying that they did or didn't meet it, or we don't think they met it, or we don't think it's the least impacting alternative, or what have you. So DES, the city can, or conservation commissions can provide comments to DES, and DES is required to address all the Conservation Commission comments.
That's Concom. I was asking about planning board. So in other words, does DES get records of all the CUPs that are addressed for wetlands?
No.
So is DES available to be consulted on wetlands CUPs? Or what exactly do you do that can help planning board?
Well, the thing is that if there's that overlap, I guess where there's the overlap, there isn't the overlap all over, clearly. But I think if it's not a DES jurisdictional area, you're not going to get that. They have enough on their plates. It's really, now there are, the thing is that you can provide comments, and if your comments impact, or if they're the CUP that you give or don't give impacts, their application to DES or whatever, I mean, obviously there's going to be some adjustment one place or another.
DES isn't involved in a standard conditional use permit with wetlands?
No. I mean, in the past, I know that, and it's not very common, at least one permitting inspector that I knew used to check the planning board minutes to see what was discussed on the project, to see if it would help them. Was a decision made? Was a decision not made? But that's not very common.
Okay.
That it?
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, great. Thank you. very much. Thanks.
Thank you for hosting this, inviting the Cons
That's
Council,
great.
including us. Should do it more often.
Yes, I think so.